And there's also an infectious quality. Some really interesting studies suggest that when one member of a team becomes burned out and they start talking about the work differently, talking about in healthcare patients differently, that is corrosive and it can spread. And then other people join, and over time, the prevalence of burnout in that team or that unit is greater.
Welcome to the Science of Leadership, the podcast dedicated to helping you become a better leader. Here, you'll gain valuable knowledge, hear inspiring stories, and learn the scientific principles that promote exceptional leadership. I'm Tom Collins, your host, and I'm thrilled to have you join us on this journey to becoming a better leader. Today, I'm joined by my friend and colleague, Dr. Tait Shanafelt, as we delve into an increasingly important topic in leadership: how leadership capability and performance affects occupational burnout. Dr. Shanafelt is an internationally recognized physician, scientist, and expert in the field of physician well-being and burnout. He's the Chief Wellness Officer at Stanford Medicine and Associate Dean at the Stanford School of Medicine. He leads Stanford's WellMD and WellPhD Center, where he and his team work to reduce burnout and improve the professional fulfillment of healthcare professionals. He's published hundreds of scientific papers, many of which focus on today's topic, including a 2021 paper where he and his co-authors introduced the wellness-centered leadership construct. Tait, thanks for joining me today on the Science of Leadership.
Thanks, Tom. Great to be with you.
All right, getting right into it, can you start by defining what professional burnout is and follow that up by defining professional fulfillment?
So, occupational burnout is a work-related syndrome that was recognized over 40 years ago. And it's characterized by three elements: emotional exhaustion, which is losing your enthusiasm for your work, being emotionally depleted; depersonalization, which is cynicism, starting to see people that you're interacting with or people you're serving or clients as objects or impersonal rather than human beings; and then a low sense of efficacy, low personal accomplishment, feeling that you're no longer making a difference. And all of us have those feelings to some frequency and severity in our work. When they come too often and to too severe a degree, they can undermine our effectiveness in work. And this syndrome is not pop psychology. It's recognized by the World Health Organization. It's codified as defined as a work-related syndrome and driven by characteristics of your work environment. So not problems in the individual or a lack of resilience in the individual, but characteristics driven by the work environment. And it's primarily a syndrome that affects people whose work involves an intense interaction with other people: teachers, social workers, police officers, clergy, healthcare professionals, some of the highest risk groups.
Now, when we talk about leadership capability with regard to burnout, what would you say are the key factors there?
You know, in many ways, it's some of the most fundamental behaviors of leaders. Obviously, leaders do many different things, but it's some of the most foundational that are most critical. And when we've looked at that, treating people with respect and dignity, keeping them informed of what's going on in the broader organization and the work environment, asking for their input on how things could be improved in the work unit, caring about that individual's professional development and trying to facilitate it, and then recognizing a job well done are some of the specific leader behaviors that are most strongly linked to burnout.
Yeah. You've previously discussed the idea that certain leadership behaviors are linked to higher levels of burnout and lower levels of professional fulfillment. Can you elaborate on that connection and what leaders might be doing wrong, even if they have good intentions?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So we have developed a standardized scale that evaluates leader behavior, asking people who work with and report to that leader how often the leader demonstrates specific behaviors in their interactions. And what we find is that the aggregate score from that assessment scale is a strong predictor of both burnout and professional fulfillment. What's interesting is we find that the strength of that relationship is even greater for people's sense of professional fulfillment than it is for burnout. One of my colleagues, Dr. Derby, subsequently also found that that leader behavior score today sort of predicts the future burnout scores for all the individuals in the unit 2 years from now, and expanded some of the work we had originally done in a very large sample of physicians to a sample of approximately 40,000 healthcare workers in all other fields, showing that with that same scale, that association of the leader behavior score with burnout and professional fulfillment held true for leaders and teams of all different types. I think one of the other things that I find particularly interesting is we've also found that when we ask individuals how they view their broader organization and whether they feel that the value set and the actions of the organization are pointed north, if you will, and if they align with the altruistic values that the individual employees hold, what we find is that leader behavior score at the level of the work unit, so that sort of aggregate score for the leader based on all the evaluation of all the people they're leading, is also a strong predictor of how people view their alignment with the organization as a whole. And so in that sense, we often frame it that people experience their organization through the prism of the most junior leader, their local leader, and that they often interpret the intentions, the values of the organization as a whole based on how that local leader is behaving. It goes without saying that we ask leaders to do many things in organizations, and when it comes to the way they relate to the individuals in their group as well as to their team as a whole, there's sort of a wide spectrum and the way they interact. And maybe at one extreme we have sort of a command and control type approach. At another, we have an approach that's sort of laissez-faire type leadership. And in my own profession of medicine, we tend to tilt toward that latter dimension where we say, these are highly trained professionals. They have great skill. They're intrinsically motivated. They know what, they need to do, and they'll sort of find their own path, and they know where my office is, and I'm here if they need me. And that, in a sense, is really not the type of leadership people are looking for. They want a leader who's invested, who's seeking out their opinion, who's giving them voice in the collective priorities for the group and the team, identifying opportunities, and who's invested in helping them develop in the ways that they aspire to. And we often, I think, oversimplify. We tend to project, again, I'll use my own profession, that we sort of know what the aspirations of physicians are based on the role and job, and then therefore they're all going to have sort of a similar set of career ambitions. And so we support them to achieve those without recognizing how diverse the actual career ambitions of different individuals are. And so I think, those are some of the things that leaders who are really actively involved with their team members can consider of how to drive engagement and reduce that burnout risk.
Yeah, that's really informative and a lot of great information there. And as you're talking about the assumptions that are made about what physicians want and so on, it raised the question in my mind, what are the drivers of that? Is that really perhaps because physicians don't have adequate training or context or background or whatever it may be in leadership and what leadership looks like? I just published this study based on work that I did while I was there at Stanford, looking at this leadership model that I've developed of the 4 C's. And what the people that were in the study, all full professors in the School of Medicine, talked about with regard to leadership perfectly aligned with the same model that I had developed out of work with 4-star generals and admirals. And so it's this idea that, as you're alluding to, I think there are people who assume a lot in medicine, make a lot of attributions about things that probably aren't necessarily correct, and that fundamentally, this is my perspective based on data, but fundamentally, leadership is leadership. It's knowing how to interact with people in a reasonable way and to communicate and to care about them and to actually know what you're doing and all those sorts of things. And so I just wonder, do you have any thoughts on that as far as why is there what seems to be a disconnect in leadership in academic medicine, at least where we live mostly?
It's a really important question, and I think it, in part, is how much medicine has changed over the last 30 years. And historically, many physicians were in small group or solo practice. They were sort of captains of their own ship. And even those that were in large organizations like a academic medical center were really just left alone by the organization. There were much lower sort of clinical productivity expectations, and there was a tremendous amount of independence and autonomy to do academic things, whether those were scientific research or educational activities or other contributions to the organization. And increasingly, a large majority of physicians now are employed by large healthcare organizations, and those aren't small mom and pop shops. They're large organizations. Clinical productivity expectations have increased dramatically as academic medical centers have become very high volume healthcare delivery organizations. And now physicians are increasingly practicing in large groups and teams and part of a more integrated healthcare delivery system where leadership and coordination is necessary. But we didn't think much about leadership development in medicine in the past. And that as we identified a need for leaders and leadership, I'll arbitrarily say 30 years ago, we often would just pick the most experienced or senior physician in the group, or perhaps the one most respected for their clinical acumen or their scientific discoveries, and that they weren't necessarily individuals who had leadership experience or even necessarily leadership aptitude. And we didn't invest in training and developing them, assessing their performance, giving feedback, helping them grow. And I think that has slowly evolved, and organizations do give more thought to this now than they did 2 decades ago or a decade ago. But in a way, medicine, I think, is still 30 years behind the way business and other industries would have thought about this. Recognizing the importance of leaders, investing in their development, helping them grow, and having the skills they need, not just generically, but also skills specific to the leadership task they're being asked to take on. And so I think in that sense, we're behind. And it's partly just I think, the organic way this need for leadership evolved as healthcare consolidated and evolved in this direction.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And to this point of what I would call a deficit of leadership and a lack of really a farm system of development, that's one of my big goals, I guess, in life, is to try to introduce into the American medical training system the concept that leadership is really important for a successful healthcare system, the whole system across the United States. The reason that we're in the quagmire that we are is, from my perspective, physicians a long time ago abdicated responsibility to be leaders in a larger sense. And so now we don't really have, as a guild of medicine, don't have the knowledge and the capability that we need diffusely. Certainly there are pockets and people who have that. But, if you look at the NHS in the UK, leadership development is now a part of their training program. And what I envision for the future of medicine and our medical training system is that when we're considering people applying to medical school, we, instead of being enamored by a 4.0 and they went to Harvard or whatever, we say, what does this person demonstrate with regard to some of the things that would make them a good leader, that we could help build them into a great leader in the future? Same for residents and fellows and faculty and all those things. That's my hope for the future, because as I tell a lot of our faculty here, I think that is going to be instrumental in, just as your work has shown, changing the face of burnout and all those sorts of things. So, but before we get to, what is the importance of this, I wanted to, for our listeners, sort of ask the question: how does a guy who's a hematologist, oncologist, at the Mayo Clinic, making a lot of progress in that field, how does somebody suddenly kind of shift focus a little bit? You're still clinically active, obviously, but shift focus a little bit at that time when you were still at Mayo, and start this work toward occupational burnout and fulfillment and engagement and those things, to become, at least based on what I know of the literature, probably the most published person on the topic of burnout in any domain. So kind of world authority on this. What's the story there?
Serendipity, to use a word you and I have discussed before, and that I know you've studied. My initial entree into this area began as a senior resident, and you talk about sort of first observations in an early leadership role of having to lead a team and beyond just delivering care directly, help support a team of interns delivering care and mentoring and helping teach them and support them in their work. And I was preparing to do a research rotation actually in oncology communications, and I had a phenomenal mentor, Dr. Tony Bach at the University of Washington. And as we met to sort of plan what I'd be working on that month, after we had mapped that out, Tony asked if there was any other things I would like to do during our time together. And I said I wanted to study the experience of residency. And being a great mentor, Tony asked a lot of questions of what are you observing and what's catalyzing this interest. And I, described for him just watching these incredibly dedicated, altruistic people talk about their work and talk about patients and so forth in ways that I know were just incongruent with the things they held most dear and why they had made so many sacrifices to pursue this work. And, in describing that to Tony, he kind of said, I think you're talking about burnout. And believe it or not, at this point in time, there was a single study of burnout in physicians that had been done in family medicine residents at Wayne State in 1990. Was the only study in the U.S. of physicians.
Incredible.
And there had been some great studies in the U.K., but said, I think you're talking about burnout, and why do you care? And I said, because it's affecting our patients and the care we provide. And so Tony said, let me help pull together a research team and let's do a study. And we did a small study that was the first study to actually look at the relationship between burnout and quality of care outcomes for patients. And when we published that, I guess coming up on 25 years ago, it became just a real lightning rod. I often, jokingly tell this story. I was actually on a shuttle bus I was a fellow at Mayo Clinic, and I was on a shuttle bus that took employees between the two hospitals where we would do our consults. And I was riding that bus, and Paul Harvey came on the radio in the bus and said, new study from the University of Washington shows burnout in physicians leads to medical errors.
I mean, Paul Harvey was talking about you, Tait. Like, that's pretty awesome.
But I remember it was like an out-of-body experience. And I was like, that's our study. And, thinking here was a study done by a resident that was unfunded. And why was it capturing national attention? And it got a lot of, front page of USA Today and so forth. And I remember thinking it was because we had studied something that had always been recognized in an anecdotal sense, right? Sort of house of God kind of stories.
Yeah.
But we had studied it in a methodologically rigorous way, and we had also demonstrated links to quality of care, and that was why it was capturing attention in a different way. And I was fortunate, the dean of education at Mayo Clinic at the time was a hematologist. Tom Haberman, he was one of my hematology mentors. And so Tom, when we published that, said, I really like this. I'd like you to continue this research here. And let's not only study the negative side, let's study sort of the positive end of this continuum of thriving. And so we started a study at Mayo Clinic in around 2003 that was a longitudinal study that went on for 16 years with my colleague Colin West. And, it was just sort of one thing led to another. And we started doing some national studies with the College of Surgeons as they were interested in this work. And then another sort of interesting inflection point, I had joined the faculty at Mayo Clinic and was an early career, 2 years in, junior faculty member. And our chairman of medicine was retiring. And he came to me and said, I want to give a parting gift to the department. And I'd like that to be a center, a program on physician well-being. And I'd really like this research you've done. And bring me a proposal of what it would take to start this center. And so because of that support, we started the program at Mayo in 2008 and began to look at organization and system interventions to address this issue. And so this was just sort of growing in parallel to my leukemia research career. And it snowballed over time and, reached a point where, both of these two areas were sort of a large function of my research and organizational leadership efforts. And, had the opportunity to come to Stanford in this sort of first in the country healthcare chief wellness officer role that our dean at Stanford, Lloyd Minor, created in 2017 out of a belief that this dimension of employee well-being, professional fulfillment, engagement was so critical to the success of to Stanford medicine that we needed to have an executive level leader analogous to our chief experience officer or chief quality officer who would be really driving this organizational strategy around quality or patient experience, that we needed someone driving that organizational strategy around the well-being and professional fulfillment of our people. And so it's been a very interesting journey and punctuated by just the right other leaders, right, at the right time. Initially Tony, and then Tom Haberman, many others I could name, but Nick LaRusso, who was the retiring chair of medicine, the dean at Stanford, and a number of other really important folks in the journey who are what influenced how I landed where I am.
Yeah. Well, thanks for sharing that. That's a great story. I did not know the Paul Harvey part. That only elevates you even further, in my opinion. So, thanks for sharing that. I'm sure that's interesting for our listeners. So, moving on to a question I think that's seems pretty elementary, but we always like to talk about the so what. Why is something important? But why are occupational burnout and professional fulfillment important? What sort of impacts do they have on the individuals? And in this case, we could even talk about patients, but also the organizations.
Yeah. I think fundamentally, and I know we'll get into a little bit more healthcare specific, but fundamentally for all organizations, I think the issue is that burnout undermines people's effectiveness in their work, and it undermines also their discretionary effort. And if people lose the sense of purpose, or that they're making a difference in their work, or that it matters, it changes your whole orientation of why you're showing up every day. And so there is sort of the personal side of the ledger of, although burnout is not depression and is not a global mental health disorder, it primarily relates to your professional sphere of life, there is sometimes some personal life spillover. I think we all can reflect in our own experience of, if things aren't going well at work, you're no longer finding it fulfilling, or you're frustrated or depleted by it. When you show up at home for the people who matter to you outside the hospital, your partner, your spouse, your children, your friend group, you are not your best self. And so there are those personal consequences for your own motivation, your relationships. We've published 2 studies of over 5,000 physicians showing every 1 point change on these 30 to 50 point subscales of burnout are associated with increased risk of problematic alcohol use as a coping mechanism. So there are all of these personal consequences. But then again, on the organizational front, fundamentally, these folks are no longer able to do their best work. And there's also an infectious quality, some really interesting studies that are, have limitations, but suggest that when one member of a team becomes burned out, and they start talking about the work differently, talking about in healthcare patients differently, and that is corrosive, and it can spread, and then other people join, and over time, the prevalence of burnout in that team or that unit is greater, and that experience of the individual not only can affect their own work, can begin to rub off on their team. And so I think that second half is why organizations can't just approach this through the vantage of, Tom, if you don't like your job, maybe you should do something else, or maybe you weren't cut out for this, or maybe you should take better care of yourself, when it's fundamentally impacting our, what we provide, what we deliver.
Mm-hmm.
That undermines our organization's ability to achieve its mission. And so we have to, recognize that and approach it with a serious mind as an organization.
Yeah. Well, as you were talking, I was just thinking, I'm sure it's a familiar thing in the state of Washington, but one bad apple spoils the whole bunch, right? Like it is, as you said, it is corrosive, infectious, metastatic, perhaps even, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that once that process begins, that's hard to reverse. That takes a lot more energy to shift the tide the other direction. I was just thinking about some responses. I'm sure you have gotten so many more of these responses than I have, but in the work that I've done on this, in this domain with regard to burnout and fulfillment engagement, how do you respond to those usually late career, people who say these people are just weak or defective or whatever, they need to quit crying, they need to just suck it up, they need to whatever it is? Because I've had that happen several times, and trying to point them to the data, I think that they just, you mentioned at the outset, this isn't pop psychology, but so how do you confront that or respond to it, I guess?
Yeah, it's, these generational wars are sort of always with us. And I think, again, it's an oversimplification. People like to,
Mm-hmm.
characterize a younger generation a certain way to, it's an approach to sense making. But usually those type of characterizations I always find are so oversimplified, right? I'll
Yeah.
say in my own profession again, ascribing, a generational profile of millennials as a, group of millions of people, suggesting they have one set of values and orientation, and that then you're going to project that on every individual from that age range that you meet is a disservice. And even more so, the subset of people who chose to go to medical school, who sacrificed a great deal for their training and for residency and fellowship and so forth, and to again then project generalizations from I think again it's off the mark. But I think what is more constructive to your question specifically of how do you approach those older colleagues, I think it's trying to redirect the conversation in a different path of that. Look, we may not all see eye to eye on everything, of people at different stages of a career, and dealing with some dealing with 2 career relationships, some not, some dealing with school age children, some not, some more established and experienced in delivering care, and where they can be more efficient because they've been doing it for 20 years. They've seen it all.
Sure.
So, recognizing that we are all different, and some folks, may experience the demands of work differently. But at the end of the day, I think generally there's a notion of we want to provide the highest quality care for our patients. We want to do it in a sustainable way. We want to have a group of colleagues who are working toward shared purpose and supporting each other. And to do that effectively, we need to understand one another, and what are all the things that are barriers to us doing that together, and can we think about how we might re-engineer, optimize the work environment, the way we design the work, our workflows, the way we function as teams, the way we cover each other, and so forth. Are there ways we can optimize that serve all of us better, even if you say, I can't believe, Tait only wants to work 55 hours a week instead of the 75 that I work. But I do think sometimes those, generational issues come into play. I think the other thing that comes into play quite often that's not always a generational element, because it often comes from a mid-career person who I'll just refer to as just the cynic, that nothing will change. We talk about it, but nothing will ever be done. Incorrectly states that the only thing that is ever promulgated to address this is personal resilience, when many organizations are doing substantive practice redesign and optimization. But they've kind of been burned before, because there was a time when people would acknowledge it, but then not do anything about it. They've kind of watched some of those failed attempts in the past, and they're skeptical. When you hear those comments, I think that the important piece to recognize is that the trust has been broken. That all of those comments are a reflection that the organization has broken the trust in the relationship it has with this physician. And they're expressing these statements that reflect that broken trust. And that, I think, meeting them there, of just acknowledging it oftentimes, of that, I can understand why you would say that, because we have seen failed attempts in the past, or, hollow gestures. And that, that is a real history. But there is a desire to try to do better and to try to make a more serious commitment. And, we do need the input of those who care about that and want that new effort to be successful, to help it, achieve its intent. And I think also to sometimes challenge those folks too, of that it's easy to point out problems or to point out the failed attempts of the past. What's harder is to try to come up with pragmatic and feasible new solutions or new approaches that we might try. But that's what we need to help each other do. And, would you be willing to try to help us get there? And to see, and not all of them will be, but some will be able to to lean into that.
You've written about how burnout affects more than just an individual's health and well-being. It also affects patient care, getting more into our side of medicine, and overall team performance. Can you share some examples that tie those together?
Absolutely. And it's, that literature has really become quite exhaustive over the last 20 years. But I think, in a simplistic sense, there are numerous studies in both physicians and nurses that have shown strong links to occupational burnout and a host of quality of care outcomes and patient experience outcomes. And some of these are subjective, asking you about your burnout, completing the burnout scale, and then asking you about medical errors and so forth. But others are objective, correlating your survey scores with independently collected unsolicited patient complaint scores over the ensuing, time interval. Looking at correlations, at least, between burnout by units of nurses and hospital line infections on those units, mortality on those units, and then also objective data looking at relationships between burnout scores and people cutting their clinical time devoted to clinical care prospectively, is independently assessed by payroll records, and then also how the different employees complete that burnout score today and their objective turnover or departure rates from the organizations over the ensuing 2 years. And so I think that there's just a lot of data on all of those fronts. We had published, a colleague of mine, Daniel Tofik, a systematic review and meta-analysis in 2019, looking at over 100 studies involving 250,000 healthcare professionals and looking at 25 to 30 different quality of care outcomes across those studies. And suffice it to say that the relationship there is very strong. And so I think we already have a lot of very compelling evidence in that domain. And I often, suggest there that, of course, we can always learn more and better understand new ways in which this is impacting outcomes. But we already have such overwhelming data there that I think it's more constructive for us to put the energy into evaluating it, designing, evaluating, and testing interventions.
Right.
And I'll maybe just conclude this too. When you really think about the triple aim of healthcare, obviously it's been expanded, but if we think about, our sort of aspirational goals for healthcare, we have data that this is causing people to reduce clinical work effort, to turnover. Those are massive access levers. We have very strong data that it impacts patient experience, and impacts other quality metrics. And we also have data that it impacts the costs of care, both due to turnover, but also some interesting data that, for example, when a primary care provider retires early or turns over, and you look at the amount of testing that's done and the amount of specialty referrals that are done over the ensuing year for a panel of patients based on whether they had continuity or had a new care provider, the specialty referrals and imaging and unnecessary testing goes up dramatically, as you would expect, because if you've been seeing me for my chronic back pain for 15 years and you've evaluated before, and I come in and I'm complaining about it today, you're familiar, and we're going to have a different conversation. Whereas a new person who replaced you is probably going to order another, MR and or refer me to ortho. And so there are also these cost implications. So in that sense, really, this is undermining all of our aspirational goals for healthcare. It's improve quality, have better access, lower costs, better patient experience and outcomes. All of those are threatened by occupational burnout.
Yeah. It's like hitting people over the head with a club, right? Like, it's very clear this is a problem. It has a lot of negative impacts, not to mention the human side of it, like the effect on the people who are experiencing it.
That's right.
But the system and the health of our nation and all those things. Well, previously you've shown that leadership capability directly impacts burnout levels among those that we lead. And you and your team there when you were at Mayo found that every 1 point increase in a physician's leadership score was associated with a 4-point decrease in the likelihood of burnout among physicians and a 9% increase in satisfaction. That says that, leadership isn't just about getting results, it's also about creating an environment where those we lead can thrive without burning out. That's what those data say to me. When you think about the state of healthcare and perhaps even society as a whole, what's your biggest fear when it comes to all of this?
Personally, my biggest fear is that the altruistic soul of our profession will be lost.
Ooh.
And that physicians, nurses, most healthcare professionals, enter their work with a sense of calling, and they have this deep commitment to serving others. They've made huge sacrifices, continue to make huge sacrifices to live up to that. Pandemic obviously is a very recent example of people putting their lives in jeopardy to care for our patients and communities at a time when we didn't know a lot. And as someone who lost my closest colleague due to complications of COVID in my own hematology practice, people, some have given their lives to serve their patients. And to the extent we have these work environments and work structures that feel like they're a barrier to them being able to do right by their patients and provide the best care to their patients and get them what they need. And that there's so much bureaucracy and inefficiency in the system that they feel powerless to fix that. At some point, they just feel like they have to stop trying because they care, they take a lot of runs at it, and eventually they just feel that it's futile. We then often try to, ask them to just do more in less time, see more patients who are more complex today than they were a decade ago or certainly 20 or 30 years ago. So seeing more complex patients in smaller increments of time with an expectation that they do so in a compassionate way that involves shared decision making, that it's sort of an impossible task. And then we just try to solve it by paying them more or to solve it in a way that's just very transactional. And it fails to recognize that that's not why they do this. They do this out of this sense of calling and commitment and a desire to do good and help their patients. And that we're creating a structure where we're undermining that. And I think if we ever lose that sort of heart of the professions in healthcare, all is lost, in my opinion. All is lost. Healthcare cannot live up to any of its aspirations without that altruism and dedication of our physicians, nurses, pharmacists, therapists, nurse practitioners, PAs. And so that's my biggest fear.
Well, that's a stark sort of warning. Okay, Tait, we've talked about what burnout is, how it's tied to our leadership capability, the major impacts we're seeing as a result of burnout and lack of fulfillment. How can we and our listeners change this? What are some practical steps, levers, if you will, that we can as leaders take to have a positive impact on burnout?
I often like to frame, Tom, that I think leadership is the longest lever we have to address this problem. And I really believe that's true. I often say that if people feel they have meaningful work and they are well led, right? Even if those buggers at the top don't understand us and aren't doing the right thing, we're well led as a unit and we're controlling the things we can control. And our leader is listening to us, responsive to our concerns and needs, supporting us at the level of the unit, and have a group of team members who have each other's back. I honestly think you could probably survive with nothing else and be quite effective,
Humanity, right?
right? Meaningful work, team members who have shared purpose and have each other's back, and we're effectively led at the most local level.
Yeah.
You will persevere through almost anything and everything, and you probably can even thrive. And so I think all of those things, though, are largely dependent on that local leader. Because, whether you've got a shared sense of purpose of team and whether people are a community that you've helped nurture and that they do have each other's back and that you are invested in those individuals and that you're helping them recognize and continue to be able to drive meaning in their work are things that the local leader does have a lot of influence on. And so in that sense, obviously leadership is a really broad universe of skills. And some of those skills are really important in some contexts and less so in others. And then there's sort of some of the foundational core, I think, as you've indicated, that are pretty transcendent. And, when we put together the wellness-centered leadership construct with Dave Logan, a former associate dean in the business school at USC, who's a international expert who studied the scholarly fields of leadership in many different fields. And we were working with Dave to talk about some of this data in healthcare leadership and how did it fit into the broader context, and then specifically which subdimensions of leadership most germane for the engagement and burnout. We distilled it down to these three things, which were caring about people always. And that, in a sense, is, I think, recognizing that you as a leader play an important role in the well-being of the people you're leading. And that's a heavy weight if one really thinks about it, that the professional fulfillment, the risk of burnout, the welfare of your team members, and the spillover effect on their families is going to be influenced by your leadership. I mean, that is a mantle that is a heavy one, but we have to embrace it. And to understand that our team members have multifaceted needs as individuals. So those are kind of the care always. And then there's the cultivate relationships, which is both cultivating relationships with each individual team member, if you're leading a team of 20 members or thereabouts or less, and investing in their individual success. And then nurturing the interrelationships of the team, right? Trying to build that community of the team and helping that team have a collective vision and a shared sense of purpose. Because we need to not just have every individual have their personal career aspirations. We do want to help support those, but we also need to help them understand how they're contributing to the shared purpose of the team. So that's sort of that cultivate relationships, second domain. And then the third domain is inspire change. And in that sense, it's helping the team think beyond current state, providing people the opportunity to make suggestions for improvement, building consensus of which of those suggestions will be prioritized and are possible now, and then empowering the team to drive change in those prioritized areas that have been determined to be possible. And I think in that sense, that inspire change one is a little bit of just, it's the candle in the dark, right? No matter how bad the current circumstance is, if you believe we're getting better, you will keep moving forward. And in that sense, again, coming to healthcare, a unit where things might not be great, but they have a leader who's committed, that's empowering people to make progress, and people are seeing effective change and says, we're not there now, but we're getting better every 3 months, every 6 months, every year, in some ways is a much more favorable place to be than a unit that's average, that's stale and stagnated. Because they still see the things that aren't working, but they're not addressing them and they're not getting better. And in that sense, it's better to be in a unit where change, we will always be changing, right? We're always improving, and your voice and your the needs you're raising are the ones we're working on and advancing. And so I think that's how we think about this for leaders, of sort of those care always, cultivate individual relationships, inter-team relationships, and then inspiring change.
Those are great. We'll include in the show notes and description, reference to that model in the paper. So that's helpful. A follow-up question. Okay. How would you advise, because you talked a bit about the increasing demands for quality with less time, patient-centeredness with less time, and all these metrics and things that we face that are real. But how would you advise leaders to be able to strike the balance between driving performance and fostering well-being?
It's challenging to do, and oftentimes partly because we're handed the edict of the productivity expectations for the unit. We don't get to decide that. It's oftentimes, assigned to us as a unit leader, and then we're supposed to make it so. But I think I'll say it often in my mind, it starts with understanding the team's why or the team's motivation. And again, that is different than the organization why or the organization's motivation, right? The mission statement of the organization, they're always nice and global and we promulgate, but that might not be exactly the way the team would describe their motivation and why they're, in your world of what really is driving us as pediatric cardiologists, right? And so it's understanding that team why, helping that, team develop that shared vision of what the team is hoping to accomplish, and then helping them see how that does connect with the organizational mission. And then again, I think once we have that, right, that we understand the team why, kind of a shared vision of what we're trying to do, how does it fit with that broader organization, even if there might be some additional elements. To the extent we can, it's then also giving the team the objective and leaving the how to them. And I think this is one that we don't do well in healthcare.
Yeah.
And, if we're trying to ramp up productivity, rather than saying to the pediatric cardiologists in your team, Tom, of this is what we're being asked to do, it's not a nefarious ask. It's that, we had to give raises to every employee because inflation is up, but Medicare reimbursement is down. And there's no way we can give raises to the people because we're getting paid less unless we see more patients. And so we want to treat our people right. That's our motivation. But to do it, we've got to be able to see more. And our ask to you is this, and can you all as a team think about how you could serve patients in new and different and more effective ways that would accomplish that in a way that aligns for pediatric cardiology, which might be a totally different solution set than pediatric GI or a surgical practice. And there's creativity down there. People come up with different answers, and that I can see these kind of patients in a shorter way and whatever it is, and these others, that people can come up with those solutions. But because we don't trust them and it's harder and it might take us a little bit longer to let the peds cardiology team discern that, we do things like take control of the template centrally and shorten every visit across the entire ambulatory practice by 5 minutes, which is incredibly ineffective, demoralizing. It disrespects the knowledge and expertise of the teams and represents a lack of understanding of, I'll say to my world, what does a leukemia clinic visit look like? And what does it take to have the conversations about the circumstances people are dealing with?
Right.
And just shortening every visit by 5 minutes just reflects a lack of understanding and respect for the work. But so that to me is, again, where to the extent we can, just give us the target and let us figure out how we're going to meet it. And you can hold us accountable to meet it, but don't dictate how to us.
Yeah.
And so I think that's the other thing of, is we think about trying to, support these well-being metrics, but, also drive productivity. It's, again, give people the objective, trust them with the how. You can hold them accountable, but that's the way you've got to do it. And then the last thing I'll say is sometimes even all of that's hard, but in parallel, also just constantly be improving the unit. So even if we got it handed to us and they said we are just shaving 5 minutes and we're stuck with it, there often are still other things we can do that you say, look, our cross coverage system isn't optimal when I'm on vacation, or the way we're assigning weekend duty, or the way we're rooming patients in our workflows has some inefficiencies. And if we could do this, I would be waiting less in between visits. And so that, how are we always identifying the opportunities? Can't do them all at once, but identify a small list, prioritize them, and keep whittling away at those things at the same time. That, that can also counter some of those higher level pressures.
I'm reminded, and I'm at this particular moment, not necessarily recalling it perfectly, but I think it was General Patton who said, give people the goal and don't dictate the answer to them, and they will amaze you with their creativity, something on that order, right? I mean, and I think that I hear you, saying that. Additionally, I'm hearing autonomy with guardrails, or guided autonomy, but collaboration, right? And I think that's missing in a lot of organizations, is this sense of collaboration.
I love the Patton quote. I know that quote that you referred. I don't remember, like you said, I don't remember the exact, but I remember exactly like you said. It's so on point.
Yeah. All right. Last question. Okay, Tait, you've made it clear that we as leaders play a major role in changing the state of occupational burnout and fulfillment. As we close, is there anything else you would leave with me, with our listeners, when it comes to how to master this?
I think the last thought I would offer is that we have evidence that leaders' own well-being impacts their leadership performance. And in this study, we had leaders complete their own standardized assessments of occupational burnout, professional fulfillment, self-compassion scores. And we, in parallel, had their teams independently complete that leader behavior score, as well as those same scales for their own well-being. And what we found first was that leaders' burnout score, professional fulfillment score, self-compassion score did not directly correlate with scores for their team members in that domain. So, if Tom is burned out, it doesn't inherently mean that the leaders of your team are going to have higher burnout. So you're not a role model necessarily in that sense. But leaders' scores on those wellness domains predicted their leader behavior score. And so in that sense, I think it's really compelling that the way your own well-being shows up to your team is that it affects how your leadership, and again, has this powerful evidence that leaders' well-being is critical to their leadership performance. And I think in a sense, this is permission giving in a way for leaders, because sometimes we think it's selfish to take care of ourselves. My team's working so hard. I've just got to grind it. I've got to, do this extra thing at 10 or 11 o'clock at night. And then you show up the next day and you're not an effective leader, right? Your emotional intelligence isn't quite as high. You're a little more reactive. You're less intentional. You're more likely to be directive than to ask questions. You're not as effective a listener. And so I think in that sense, I often ask leaders to reflect on a circumstance where, a challenging event in the life of their team, or if their leadership role in the last month, and then to ask them to reflect on how their own well-being, good or bad, in that moment. Because I was just back from vacation and I was fresh and rested and thoughtful, I was more perceptive, or I was running fast back to back, and but how much their well-being in that specific example impacted their leadership effectiveness in a favorable or unfavorable way. And it is always amazing to me that the normal numbers people come up with is between 20 and 30% more or less effective, but there's always a wide range. And there's always some folks in the audience who give a 50 to 75% less effective than I normally would have been because I was myself not well.
Yeah.
And so I think that's always just a point of reflection of if I asked that same leader, tell me anything else in your day-to-day, month-to-month leadership journey that would make you 30% more effective today in the challenging things you're going to encounter, or maybe 50%, 70% more effective today. You can't give me anything, right? And so I think, again, it just speaks to that notion of it's important for us as organizations and as leaders to view the well-being of our leaders as part of their leadership development. And we need to take care of them so that they can be more effective leaders for their teams. And again, I just don't think most of us as organizations think that way. We just keep piling on our leaders. And we need to both encourage them. This is a priority. We need to demonstrate that to them. We need to help support them in that. And then leaders need to have permission for themselves that, sometimes that extra night of sleep or that time with your family or making sure you are sharpening the saw, right, in a class like Stephen Covey, is really essential.
Yeah. As you were talking, I was just thinking about post-call, if we call it syndrome, right? Like thinking back when we were in training, especially when there were no work hour rules, you're not effective at all the next day. And so nobody would now recommend to leaders that they be on call every night, and do their job. That they could recognize, I would be terrible at that. Well, it's the same thing. It's just a different manifestation. So yeah, I think that's really important. Wellness, our personal wellness, really is vital if we're going to lead and we're going to help our folks to avoid occupational burnout and have professional fulfillment. So, well, Tait, thanks for being on the Science of Leadership with me. It's really been a delight, and I really appreciate it.
No, I really enjoyed the visit. Thanks, Tom.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of the Science of Leadership. We hope today's discussion has inspired you and given you valuable insights to help you become a better leader. Remember, leadership is about helping those we lead do great things. It's a journey of continual growth and learning. When we embrace that journey with curiosity, courage, and humility, we can confront challenges, overcome barriers, and foster environments where everyone can succeed. If you enjoyed today's episode, be sure to follow or subscribe, leave a comment, and share it with others who are passionate about leadership. Until next week, keep leading with character, competence, caring, and communication. This is Tom Collins. Let's keep growing.